In a short biography of yours, I read that after working for 10 years as a business analyst, you decided to do a PhD in history, and one of your main areas is pensions. What made you focus on pensions?
Well, partly because I'd worked for 10 years in the life and pension sector, and probably mainly because I knew it would get funded.
You close your book chapter, Politics and Pensions in Post-War Britain, in the book Britain's Pension Crisis, History and Policy, very popular pension research literature, with a claim made by the Pensions Commission, which is that Pension Commission's proposals are the framework for achieving a national consensus on the way forward. Drawing on this, I would like to ask you if today, would you say that this national consensus has been achieved?
I think it has. The Pension Commission was a refreshing departure in as much as for most of the post-war period, British pensions existed in a kind of state of permanent revolution and were generally the subject of inter-party contestation. And I think opening up the Blair government's decision to appoint the Turner Commission was a very good move. And I think it did result in the creation of a consensus. I think that consensus is fraying a bit at the moment, and particularly I think since 2010, it's been put under a lot of pressure. And I think there are questions, although I'm a great admirer of the Turner Commission actually, I think one can raise questions about the nature of the consensus and about its utility for the long term.
What kind of questions about the nature?
I think quite plainly Britain did have a pensions crisis at the point at which the Turner Commission was undertaking its investigations. And of course, it shared that experience with most advanced economies. Britain's pensions crisis was complicated by the fact it also had what the Turner Commission described as the most complicated pension system in the world at the time, which in a sense was the result of more than half a century of constant revolution and an abiding tendency to think that you could somehow replace what had been the existing system, you could replace it with something new, and a lack of recognition that actually pensions embodies very, very profound path dependencies which tend to lock in any institutional solution. And so over time, the UK had piled up a series of sub-elements within its overall pensions system. And the architecture of those elements and of the interactions between them was a barrier, really, to reform. In fact, I think it was a bigger barrier to reform than the Turner Commission itself acknowledged. It recognised that the situation it was facing was the product of history. What it didn't do, really, was explicitly recognise the ways in which options for change had been constrained by the settlements of the past. One could say that's a failing of the Commission, the recognition. I'd like to think that had it recognised it, we might have been able to extend the debate. But as it was, we didn't, and therefore we worked with what we had. And we worked with the constraints that we had, and that shaped the proposals that it delivered.
Can you give us an example of these elements from the history that were not sufficiently recognised?
You know, we started off in the late 40s with effectively one flat rate universal pension, the Beveridge pension. We then added to that state pension a rather vestigial and dishonest graduated pension embodying a so-called link to earnings in 1961. Then we added the state earnings-related pension system in 1978. Then in 2002, we added we converted that to the state second pension, but we didn't get rid of SERBs. In parallel with that, we had first of all we had the development of mass occupational pensions. Then we had the personal pensions revolution. Then we had the stakeholder pensions revolution. I mean, my partner, for instance, has at the time the Turner Commission was sitting, was amused to find that she actually had 9 completely different pensions, and within that she had multiple occurrences of quite a few of them. And not surprisingly, she was absolutely baffled as to what she was actually going to get, as was everybody. Nobody understood the system. Not even experts understood the system. There was no way that British workers understood the system that they were operating in. And that's a big problem that Turner recognised. It recognised that it was operating with a profoundly complicated system that wasn't delivering. And part of the reason it wasn't delivering was that it was too complex, and the complexity was putting off. For example, putting off people. For example, it was putting off employers providing occupational pensions because it was a huge burden on them to get to grips. You know, a new employer setting up a pension scheme, that burden was a barrier to providing something for their workers. And similarly, I think one of the things the Pensions Commission did was to recognise that behavioural psychology was an important element of the pensions crisis. But one element of that was that the system was so bloody complicated that the average person just thought, oh, I really need to do something about my pension, and then forgot about it because it was just too much effort to get to figure it out. And you were almost certainly going to make mistakes. So you would live to rue in the long term. And so people dealt with that problem by doing nothing.
You mentioned before that after 2010, we can see an erosion of this consensus.
Well, I think the consensus on the core element, which is the automatic enrolment, I think has persisted. I think and that's a good thing to an extent. The consensus around the state system, of course, did not persist, not least because Steve Webb did something, as Pensions Minister, did something very, very unusual, which is he actually abolished an element of the system. Not immediately, as everybody was led to believe, and then found to their shock was not the case. They weren't getting this unified new state pension. But over the long term, he will have removed an element from the system. But it's the element that still preserves some earnings relation. And so the consensus that was formed by the Turner Commission, I think there's still a consensus, but I think it has evolved to encompass a changed conception of what a state pension should be.
Do you have in mind the objectives behind the state system?
Well, the objectives and the actual outcome, which is in effect we went back to Beveridge, which was to have a flat rate state pension at a fairly minimal rate, thus leaving a very significant space for individual initiative, thrift, voluntary provision, one way or another. Personally, I regret that slightly, more than slightly, in fact.
I would like to ask you if there are any positive outcomes from establishing a scheme like NEST, a state-run DC workplace pension scheme.
Without a doubt. Well, no, let me rephrase that. I think there had to be a state-run backstop. And in that sense, NEST was a necessary element of reform. We could have a long conversation about whether it should have been DC, and that, for me, is what is the big failing of the new settlement.
A more general question: why NEST has been successfully implemented? In the sense, why actors like the pensions industry and the trade union accepted NEST?
Of course, the pensions industry wasn't very keen on the idea of NEST. There was a lot of institutional resistance from existing private pension providers for obvious reasons of self-interest. On the other hand, at various points since the Second World War, some illusions about the desire of private pension providers to provide pensions for everybody have been exposed. And I think they were exposed again. The reality is that private pension providers want to provide pensions to certain workers, but not all workers. And that's because they don't really want to deal with workers on low incomes because there's no money in it. There's no profit to be made in it. The costs of administration are relatively high, the rewards are relatively low, and the chances are you're going to end up making a loss. So the two big previous proposals to provide occupational pensions for everybody, for instance, both in the 50s and the 70s, both ran up against the fact that the pensions industry didn't want to have compulsory private pensions because it would be ruinously unprofitable for it. So it was always going to need to be an institutional backstop, and NEST provided that, and I think seems to have done a good job in as much as it is able.
Why trade unions accepted NEST? Drawing on your article, really. In 1954, when there was a proposal about a superannuation scheme where everybody will be involved, was rejected.
Well, I think the context had changed. Mm-hmm. So trade unions in the 1950s, and indeed in the 1970s, when they were defending existing occupational schemes, they didn't want that replaced with a state-run alternative because it would almost certainly reduce the benefits that their members would receive. So they were very keen to defend the existing defined benefit settlement, both in the 50s and the 70s. What had changed, of course, was that defined benefit settlement was in the process of implosion. And auto-enrollment into DC was, I don't think was any trade union's ideal, but it was a lot better than nothing. Mm-hmm. And hence they tended to support it.
Let's now see the automatic enrollment and behavioral economics.
Okay.
So you mentioned also something before about the influence of behavioral economics, the combination of psychology and economics. And what we have seen is that there is an increasing influence of behavioral economics in pension policy. To what you will attribute this increasing influence of behavioral economics and policy?
So I think that's an easy question to answer.
Okay.
and it's John Hill's.
Yeah.
So I think his presence on the Turner Commission was absolutely decisive. I don't know who chose him or why he was chosen, but he was a very good choice. Okay. And I think he injected into the deliberations of the Pensions Commission a very clear agenda around behavioural economics and on how it could explain elements of the problem that the nation was facing and be utilised in constructing a solution.
So you cannot see any risks or challenges by relying on behavioral economics to reform a pension system.
You know, the great insight was automatic enrolment, and in a sense, you know, actually, in many ways, a more rational solution to the problem would have been compulsion, because as soon as you say we're going to auto-enroll, you're creating the possibility that people will opt out, and that then creates a long-term possibility of poverty, which probably is going to generate demand for state spending. Whereas compulsion, you can kind of get around that. But the reality is that in the context of a political economy which was quite resistant to compulsion, the next best thing was probably automatic enrolment, because if you just left it if you put the onus on the individual, or even on small companies, or on companies, most of which were small, then you were just going to embed the existing problem, which was a lack of engagement. Whereas auto-enrolment was a rather neat way to square that circle, I think. And you know, I mean, I remember reading the report and thinking, yes, I think that's a very creative use of the insights of behavioural economics to address a public policy problem.
So now I would like to move on to the state pension. What do you think are the main drivers pushing for a more generous flat-rate state pension, given the persisting affordability issues?
Steve Webb's construction of the new state pension reflected a strain of liberal thought, which has been very, which we find pretty consistently in British pensions, and you know, going right back to Beveridge. That I applaud Webb for making the system simpler, and I think that was the right thing to do. But let's not kid ourselves, it's not generous. It's very minimalist, and it only makes sense with top-up provision. Yeah. And therein lies the problem, that we don't have 100% top-up. There are obvious problems for the future there. It's cleared away a lot of the undergrowth of state pensions, and in that respect it's a good thing. But it's not worth much in the greater scheme of things. And I think over time what might happen to it is rather what happened to the original flat rate pension, which is that its value will deteriorate. In the absence of 100% top-up coverage, yes, yeah. I mean, to be honest, I don't think we're going to get away from means-tested supplementation even now, and you know, I'd be very surprised if it disappears over the long term.
Now, about the return to a flat-rate pension, if you can see something in terms of facilitating any conception of social democracy?
Yes and no. You know, when the flat-rate pension was introduced in the late 40s, one can see it as a kind of social democratic settlement in its equality. Everyone gets the same pension. The problem, which very, very rapidly became apparent in the 1950s, was that was everybody had the same set share in poverty, and therein lay a problem. And so, in theory, the flat rate state pension is completely consistent with social democracy, but it all depends at what rate it is set and whether that rate is maintained, I think. Because actually, if you look at if you look at the historical reaction to the flat rate pension on the part of trade unions, they have not been very keen on it. What they wanted to do is to get something better for their members. And that's why they were always attracted to earnings-related pensions. Because in the heyday of trade unionism, you could bargain for higher wages, but in doing so, you were also bargaining for higher pensions. And to an extent, that is still true, even despite the weakening of trade unions. Certainly true in the public sector. Private sector is a different issue, I think. But I don't think that's why I don't think the flat rate pension is by definition consistent with social democracy, because I don't take social democracy to mean poverty in old age.
Oh, I would like to close with a few questions about pensions as opposed to other areas of welfare provision, and in particular social care and working age benefits. Do you think that there is something with pensions that made the reform happen as opposed to other areas like social care reforms? Why do you think?
Okay, so I think there are probably two parts of the explanation for that. I would say this isn't something I know a huge amount about, but I would say the key difference between pensions and social care is everybody needs an income in old age, but not everybody needs social care. So that instantly distinguishes the two, I think, and it makes it more difficult to address the issue of social care. But the bigger factor, of course, is the transformed economic environment. That the pension reforms that flowed from the consensus of the early 2000s, they were constructed in good times. Social care has been constructed in a time of profound austerity with a much greater pressure or pressure of longevity, precisely because we're 10 to 15 years further into the ageing population. And I think probably in combination those have been profoundly problematic for social care. I mean, it is a great regret that we haven't managed to do something about social care. And the other thing, of course, is the shifting political economy. Is that actually, what was the Cameron government interested in? Well, its interests were different from the interests of the Blair and Brown governments, I think. Do you think there are differences in how pensioners and care recipients are viewed as electorates? Yes, I think it's not occurred to me before, but I think there is a difference there, but that goes back to what I just said. Is that I think everybody knows they're going to be a pensioner. Everybody hopes they're not going to be in need of a large amount of social care, and in that sense, that probably does shift the political dynamic, in as much as because everybody knows they're going to be a pensioner, everybody has views about it, and we were talking about behavioural economics, and I mean one of the abiding problems that pensions voluntarism in pensions has always encountered is that people aren't very keen to think about themselves in old age. But if that's true, they're even less keen to think about themselves in a situation of dependency and incapability, and in need of very expensive continuing social care. I think that behavioural problem that exists in pensions is even more so when it comes to social care. Social care reforms have been neglected due to bad times or austerity, and different priorities. Different priorities. Of course, there's I think there's a problem of institutional structure at the heart solving the social care crisis, which is a further complication in as much as we've got this huge division between an NHS, which is historically focused on the treatment of chronic illness, acute illness, and local authority-run social care, which deals with chronic conditions. And you're taking a national institution and a multiplicity of local institutions and bolting those together without absolutely fundamental reform is an incredibly hard thing to do. I think that's another part of the dimension of the crisis that's facing us in social care. Yeah.
There were some thoughts about replacing the triple lock in pensions.
I think that almost certainly, that's what I was getting at with, I think in the longer term, the flat rate pension, I think the guarantees are going to be whittled down. So at the moment, everything looks good because the triple lock means, in effect, they're going to constantly rise as a proportion of average earnings. But it's not hard to envisage a world in which bits of, the triple lock becomes a double lock, becomes a single lock, becomes no lock at all. And I'm not, I wouldn't be at all surprised to see an erosion of the guarantee.
So one of the arguments in favour of the double lock is that it will bring equity between working age population and pensioners, given the cuts that have taken place in working age benefits.
Yeah.
What do you think about this?
I think that's a difficult question, and I think the issue of intergenerational equity is an issue that we've often ducked. I think one of the reasons I think the guarantee will be whittled away is, one thing is I don't see the economic situation getting better. So actually, we're probably locked into pretty much a permanent austerity. And in that context, the triple lock looks pretty unsustainable. But I think it's also pretty clear to me that the intergenerational question will probably become more pressing and will be another reason for eroding the commitment, because plainly it does work to the disadvantage of younger people. But I think it does go back to it goes back to a question that you asked earlier about the politics of pensions, and in a sense it's a product of something very obvious, which is differential turnout at general elections. And as long as older people go on voting in much greater numbers than younger people, the system is skewed to them. But when people get angry, they vote, and that's why I suspect the intergenerational question will rise up the political agenda. Well, I just wanted to develop the conversation we had about auto-enrolment. So, if you're looking at, its great success is that it's raised coverage. So, it's now 76% of people have got a workplace pension, and that's great. It's up nearly 30 percentage points since auto-enrolment began. So, that's to be applauded. But the fact is that only 36% of workers are in a defined benefit pension scheme. And membership of defined benefit schemes is highly correlated with age. So, for somebody in their late 50s, there's about a 50% chance they're going to be in one. About 35%, I think. But for somebody in their mid-20s, it's down to 20%. And then you've got sectoral differences, and you've got the catastrophic differences between large and small firms. So AE has been good for enrolment, and it's been good for coverage, for workplace scheme coverage, but the fact is I think the pensions that it delivers are going to prove to be pretty inadequate. And the danger is that we applaud ourselves because coverage is increasing and for the success of auto-enrollment without thinking about actually what sort of pension are people going to get at the end of it. So, fairly obviously one thing is if you don't have any earnings, you don't have any contributions, you don't have any pension. If you take time out from the workplace because you're caring for children or for elderly parents, you have a major hit to the pension that you're going to get in a way that actually we managed to deal with in the settlement of the late 70s by crediting in people, disproportionately women, who were suffering from patchy contribution records because of caring. Low earners, many of them women, are not included. The contributions relate only to qualifying earnings. And even at the level that they've now reached, the total contribution is pretty low. I mean, it's 8%. So when the state earnings related pension scheme was implemented in 1978, the contribution was 16.5% in total. So half the value is going in. 4 out of 5 workers in the private sector are contributing less than 5% of their earnings. This is going to prove really problematic because with low contributions, inevitably comes the likelihood of a low pension at the end of it. And then, of course, we've got the issue that what DC in auto-enrollment has done is to embed a transfer of all risks involved in the provision of a retirement income in old age to the individual. The state's not taking a risk, employers are not taking a risk, it is all on the individual. And there's a consistent tendency in pensions to think, oh well, a growing economy will bail us out of all problems. But, we've had 10 years of going sideways on the economy and no end in sight at the moment. There is no guarantee in the long term that things are going to get a lot better. And so actually the danger is that we've created a system that we think is a good one, which is going to deliver remarkably little to people in their old age, ultimately. And therein lies a long-term problem, I think.
Maybe in 30 years from now, even if you have put your hard-earned money somewhere, we don't know what will happen.
Yeah. Obviously, the long term embodies a significant risk. And the reality is that individuals are not very well placed to cope with recognizing risk and dealing with it. So in the mid-80s, the Thatcher government attempted to get rid of all state pensions apart from a bare minimum and to convert everybody into having their own individual personal pension. I mean, even more than that, actually. John Redwood wanted everybody to directly invest their own portfolio in British companies. And, that ran up against a very obvious problem with which people in the pensions industry, the actuarial profession, were only too eager to put in front of ministers, which is the average person is innumerate, functionally innumerate. There's no way that the average worker, the average consumer, or even frankly the above average worker or consumer can cope with calculating the risks involved in different investment approaches and in comparing different pensions products from different companies, recognising the effect of charges, of differential returns between different markets. This is just beyond people. And that's a problem that actually people aren't very well placed to. It's not just that people are myopic, people just lack the skills. I can't remember the exact figure, but I think about a third of people can't tell if a 2-pint bottle of milk at £1.05 is better value than 2 1-pints at 51p. I mean, that's catastrophically low levels of numeracy within the population.
But somebody might tell you now there is the default fund, so they don't need to know anything.
No, they don't. They don't. They can go with the default, and that's fine. And that was the right thing to do, to have a default option. Absolutely. But the reality is that if things go wrong, who pays the price? It's the individual that pays the price, and that's why I mean that individuals are not very. They're not necessarily in a position to deal with it if it goes wrong.